Good afternoon. Thank you for enduring and showing up. And the portion you just observed is free. It's a free bonus content that I like to do with my talks. My name is Nathan Yergler. I'm a principal engineer at Eventbrite, and we're a Python shop that has been using Django pretty extensively for the past few years. And so I'm here today to tell you about using Django effectively, give you an introduction to Django, and specifically to some of the newer features in Django, like class-based views, some of the forms, and also focus on writing tests for your code as you build Django applications. So this is definitely an entry-level afternoon, and I hope that by the time you leave, you have a good sense of how to get started with Django, how to write tests for different things, and how to sort of approach putting your application together. I have 4 of my esteemed colleagues and friends with me this afternoon who are standing along the back, and they are waving their hands at you right now because they're all so happy to see you and so happy to be here, except Jason, who is not waving because he's not happy apparently. They're here to help you along as we work through the application. And so they're going to be wandering around, trying to help you out. If you have questions as we go along, you can flag one of them down. You can also ask me a question, and I will endeavor to answer your question. So we're going to, sort of the format is we're going to talk a little bit about different things, then we're going to demonstrate it. And the goal here is to, by the end of the afternoon, we're going to build a little address book application just as a demonstration of starting a Django project and of using some of these features that we want to focus on. There's a break halfway through. I will endeavor not to forget it. So I said this. So what do I mean by effective Django? There's 3 things that I really hope you take away from this afternoon, and that is that there are ways to use Django that get up and going really quickly, and that get you started really quickly, but they wind up causing problems down the road. And if you focus on these principles of cohesion, testability, and scalability, you're going to wind up with an application that's going to be easier to maintain in the long term, easier to add engineers to, easier to make changes to, because you're able to run the tests. I'm just going to pause while maybe the slides come back. So effectivedjango.com/tutorial is the URL for the content here that we're going to be going through, and /slides/tutorial is where the slides are. You may find some or both those to be useful. So so I guess I want to talk a little bit before we get started about your development environment and what to think about as you're working on a project. There are sort of 3 factors that are important, and I'm going to talk about those each here individually. So first of all, isolation, determinism, and similarity. These are the 3 things I look for when I'm setting up my development environment for some kind of project. And isolation basically means I want this project to be isolated from the rest of my system. I don't want things that I've installed for something else, creeping into the environment, and I don't want. I also don't want things that I'm installing for this project to interfere with other things I might be doing. The reason for this is determinism. We want to make sure that we can replicate this environment when we go to deploy, when we go to production, when we go to actually ship our application. And so by making sure it's isolated, we kind of have a record of what's going on. And I also look for similarity, which is simply something that's as similar to my production environment as I can get. So virtual env is a pretty popular and well-known way to do this isolation. There's other ways to do it, but this is a really good one. This is what we're going to use today. And determinism is all about dependency management, right? It's all about knowing what goes into your application and what you're actually using. So what we're going to use today is a requirements file with pip. But there's other approaches to this that I've linked to in the slides. One of them is simply making a setup.py for your application and being really explicit about the versions there and the dependencies. The other one is a tool called buildout, which sort of combines some of the things that virtual env and pip do together. But the really important thing here is that you identify not just your dependencies, but what versions you use, because that can make all the difference. And an example of this is if you just say that you want simple JSON because you want JSON support for your application, well, that's great. But then last month, a new version of simple JSON was released that broke backwards compatibility. So if you had just said simple JSON, next time you go to deploy this application, you're getting the newest version, which unbeknownst to you, actually breaks your app. So by specifying versions, you're testing exactly what you're going to deploy with, and you're deploying exactly what you tested, and you have some confidence, some additional confidence about how this is going to operate, how they're going to interact. And finally, this idea of similarity. Having an environment that's similar to your production environment sort of eliminates one big question mark when you're trying to debug a large system. So there's a tool called Vagrant that we're not going to talk about this afternoon, but I encourage you to go look at. It's basically a way that you can manage virtual machines in your local laptop for development purposes. And we use it at Eventbrite. I'm happy to kind of show people afterward during the break how we use it. But it basically lets everybody, we deploy on Ubuntu, but most of our engineers have Macs. And so we can use Vagrant to give them an Ubuntu virtual machine on their Mac and manage that so that it's very, very similar to the servers we're actually deploying to. So I think at this point, we're going to switch over and actually look at how we do some of this. How we do some of this in the terminal, maybe. There we go. Is that large enough, or should I make it bigger still? Bigger still. Is that visible? Right, so I mentioned that this afternoon we're going to need to use something called virtual env, and we're going to use pip with a requirements file. And so there was a Git repository that you could clone. I'm actually going to start from scratch here, and then the Git repo is useful if people need to catch up along the way. So creating a virtual environment is pretty easy. I'm going to make a new directory here called tutorial. I am going to get rid of my old tutorial. And I'm going to make a directory called tutorial. And see, wasn't that easy? And then I'm simply going to run virtual env tutorial. And if I look inside the tutorial directory now, I'm going to see a few different things. I'm going to see a bin directory, this lib, include, and this is basically mocking out things that are usually stored in the root part of the file system. If you're on Windows, you'll see something called scripts here instead of bin, but it should look pretty similar to this. And inside of this bin directory, there's a bunch of scripts. So you notice there's actually a Python executable inside this bin directory. And this is a special Python because it sets up everything to point to our virtual env and not the system Python site packages, so it keeps it isolated when you run this one. So to enter the virtual environment, you do source bin activate. If you're on Windows, this looks like, I think there's a bin activate.bat file. inside there. And you'll see that my prompt has changed. So it says tutorial at the beginning of each line, and that lets me know that I'm inside of this virtual environment and that things that I do here aren't going to impact the rest of the system. They're just going to be for this environment. So before we can actually make a Django project, we need to install Django, of course. And this is sort of our first opportunity to do something where we're very specific about and very deterministic about what versions we want. So I'm going to make a new file here in my tutorial called requirements.txt. And this is where I'm going to list everything that as my project grows, this is where I would list everything it depends upon. And I could write just Django here. And that would actually be enough for me to get Django installed. But that's going to get the latest version of Django at any given time. And I'm actually care that I get a particular version. For those of you following along with the notes, we're on page 4, section 1.2.1. I see people frantically flipping, so that's, sorry. So I could just do Django 1.5 equals 1.5, and this would make sure that I get Django 1.5. The other thing I can do here, though, let's see if I can actually do this. So there are some issues this morning with PyPy in one of the other tutorials, and I don't have any reason to think that those have necessarily been resolved. So well, let's try this way first. So if I put Django 1 equals 1.5 here, what I was going to say is you can also specify a link to a tarball directly here. So if you have your own things that you depend on that you want to list, you can do that just fine. So I'm going to say Django equals 1.5. The notes do say 1.4.3. That's what it was out when I wrote those the first time. We're going to do 1.5 today. And then I can do pip install -r requirements.txt, which is actually going to go and read that requirements file and download Django for me and hopefully install it. So So that's going a little slowly. So I'm just going to switch to another terminal here and show you the other way to do this. So instead of Django 1.5, I can actually put the full path to the tarball on Django's servers, on the Django project servers, which is admittedly harder or longer to type. If you don't see tutorial at the beginning of your lines or something in parentheses, that means you didn't activate the virtual environment, and Philip can help you with that. Is that? Well, yeah, it's maximized right now. So let me. How's that? So if you set up your file to look like this instead of just Django equals, this will probably download a little bit faster for you. totally okay. If you did 1.4.3, you're totally okay. 1.5 has some really nice additions, but they're, I don't think we're actually going to wind up touching on them very deeply today. So, and the nice thing is that, so we're going to be talking about class-based views for a big part of the tutorial, and they work the same in both versions, but the 1.5 docs are much, much better, so you can sort of mix and match that way too. So are people able to have a requirements file put together and they're doing pip install and it's downloading? Great. So while that's running, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context about Django and about this scaffolding that it provides. So the whole idea of a framework is that it's a bunch of code to help you get up and going faster and help you sort of handle common situations in a reasonable default manner. Things like parsing an HTTP request or printing out the request into a response. Things like selecting data out of the database. These are things that we don't want to have to do by ourselves. And so the framework gives us this sort of scaffolding, this framework for these tools for us to use. And it does this in a couple of ways. One of them is with HTTP, with making sure you can parse the request and the HTTP request and emit the response back to the server. And the other way is with file system scaffolding. So putting things in particular places in the file system so that engineers know where to look for things. So you can see, so I finished installing Django here. You can see that it did a few things here. It also, if I look in the bin directory or the scripts directory on Windows, it gave me this new Django admin tool. And this is sort of a tool for starting your project. So in Django, there's sort of two high-level organizational units in Django. There's the idea of a project, which is the thing that you're going to deploy, the thing that has the settings, the URLs specific for your site. And then there's the application, which is something that's potentially reusable that you might be able to plug into different projects. So, for example, tagging is something that lots of different projects need the ability to tag objects, like photos on Flickr or bookmarks on Delicious when it was still Delicious, that sort of thing. But you don't want to have to do that every time. So there might be a tagging application you can plug in. So we're going to start making a project by running Django admin, the cunningly named start project command. And our project is, we're going to make an address book project. So I'm saying start project, address book, and then I say dot as the very last parameter here. And that just tells it not to make me an extra level of directories. And once you run that, you see you have an address book directory. And it has a few things in it that we're going to look at sort of as we go through building things. Let me move that up the screen a little bit. So inside of my project, there's three things that we care about inside there. There's the settings file, which has sort of the configuration for this project you're building and for what's going to be your site. There's the URLs.py, which tells it how to map URLs to actual Python code. And then there's this WSGI, this WSGI.py file. And what this is a container or a script that will run your site inside of something like mod.wsgi or uwsgi. There's different ways you can deploy this that use this stub, this entry point. So we don't actually use it directly, but it's really important to have when it comes to deployment. There's also now this manage.py script that was created here next to our requirements.txt, which is the basically it's a wrapper around Django admin for our particular project. So I said that there's a project and it contains apps. So we're going to make an app as well. So we're going to run python manage.py, start app. And I'm going to make a contacts app. So my address book has contacts in it. This is where I'm going to actually put that code. And inside of contacts, so this is the other bit of file system scaffolding that Django provides, which is inside of an application you have these three things by default. You have models, which is where your actual data model goes, and usually where you want to encapsulate your business logic or whatever about that object. You have views, where your view code is going to live, and then you have tests. So we're going to write tests in a moment, but this is where your unit tests for your project live. And the interesting thing here is that the Django really, really wants this sort of layout for your applications. And so occasionally you'll build an application that's just views. It's just a way to visualize something and maybe some unit tests for those things. So you still have to have an empty models.py there, or it won't discover the tests. So it's sort of best to start with the tools that the sort of the scaffolding it provides, and then modify it as opposed to trying to just sort of do it by hand and pick and choose the pieces that you might want. So do people have a project created called address book, and they have an app called contacts at this point? Okay. So if people are having problems downloading Django, I have a bunch of USB keys that have Django on them, and you can install this. I don't know if this is going to feedback on me if I walk ahead of here, but basically you can do pip install and just point it at the tarball. So I'm just going to pass these around. Yeah. This? Okay. I see. I apologize for erroneously blaming PyPy. Do other people need the Django tarball? This? So if you are installing from that, within your virtual environment, you'll do pip install, and then you'll give it the file path to that tar.gz file. Yeah.
The two commands. One was a
Sure.
start project, and the other one was the start app.
That's right. So
They both made directories, right?
that's right. So the question is, can I go over the two commands again? And I have another USB if somebody needs it. So the two commands are start project and start app. Start project you run on Django admin.py. So you run Django admin. So you run Django admin start project, and then you give it something like address book. And this is the actual project name we're going to use. And they each make, and when we run it, we're actually running it like this, with a dot as the final parameter. Otherwise, it just makes you an extra level of directories that we don't actually care about. And the other, so there's that one. And then there's also, once that one runs, you'll have a manage.py, which you can run start app on. And we're going to run it with contacts. Yes. Address book space dot. And the dot just tells it what you're telling it put it in the current directory, as opposed to making a whole new level of directories for me. does that clarify those two commands, or is he still? I see you staring at the screen longingly, and so.
Yeah, so I guess where I was confused on what the role of the settings.
Got it. So the question is what the role of the settings file is, and that's where the configuration for our site is going to be stored. And we're going to, in just one moment, we're going to jump in there and start configuring things. There is another USB right now. Okay. It's right there on the front row. So are people getting things installed and ready to go? Yes, no? Right, can you pass that behind you 2 rows? So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start looking at settings, and then we'll look at some things, and we'll have a sort of a moment to catch up if we need to. So at this point we have this address book project and the contacts app. And if we look inside of address book, we have these different files. And the one I actually want to look at right now is the settings. So as I mentioned, this is the configuration for the site, or the full functionality project that you're going to deploy. And the first thing we're going to do here is create our database model, and that requires that we have a database set up. So let me make this a little bit bigger. So inside of settings, this is basically just a Python file that you're not going to import directly. Django is going to make this available for you as Django conf settings. And it uses this at startup time to figure out how to map certain Python classes to different tables in your database. Django supports a bunch of different database backends: MySQL, Postgres, SQLite. We're going to use SQLite 3 because it's included with Python. So what we need to do 2 things to configure this. We're going to open up settings, and we're going to find the databases configuration here. And under engine, you just need to add SQLite 3 to tell it what engine you're using. And then we need to give it a name. So I am going to figure out how to use VI. And I'm going to call mine addresses.db. So SQLite 3 is just a sort of a single user file system database that you wouldn't want to use in production, but this is enough, sort of enough to get going and try this out. And then basically after you configure the database, the other things Django does for you, like creating the tables and that sort of thing, will work the same on MySQL or Postgres or probably Oracle. Never tried that, but hypothetically they would work the same. So here all we have to do is actually tell it what the file is and tell it what kind of database we have. And then we can go ahead and start creating a model. So a model in Django basically maps to a database table. So in this case, we want to have a table of our contacts in our address book, and so we're going to go ahead and define what that table should look like and what the fields are. So in the contacts directory in our app, there's a models.py file that we're going to edit. And this may be a time when having the tutorial web page side by side with your editor and copy and pasting is to your advantage, as opposed to trying to type everything. But I'm going to try and type it and not make mistakes. So you can see that by default this just imports models from the database. So a A Django model is just a class in Python that subclasses from model. And then it has a bunch of, then it has fields. So these fields are themselves classes that sort of define how Python data types map to the database types, and also what validation rules there exist there. I am going to open up the tutorial. And we are in using models. So here I have, I've added 3 fields to my contact model. 2 of them are character fields that have a maximum length associated with them, and one of them is an email field. The sort of interesting thing here is, or interesting to me at least, if you think about how this all ends up working as a whole application, both character fields and email fields map down to the same type in the database. They store the same type of information. But the email field just adds some additional validation on top of things. So Django can add some additional constraints that your database probably doesn't support in terms of a constraint. And there's also ways to add your own validators to this. So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a method here called under_stir. Actually, let's do under unit. Let's do stir. Sorry. So you may know from doing Python programming that the under method, it gets used as a string representation of an object. So whenever you try to print out this object, this is what gets displayed. And this gets used in Django quite a bit. So I want to make this return for a particular contact. I want to return their name as the string representation. So I'm going to do self.firstname with a space. So, this is our basic model, and it has a string representation, and we're going to start with this. Okay. So, remember that manage.py we had created for us, Python. So it has another command here called syncdb, and syncdb synchronizes your models to your database. So it basically takes these model definitions and turns them into SQL to create the actual database tables. So if I run this, it's going to do a bunch of stuff, and then it's going to say, do you want to create a user? Yeah, sure, I'll create a user. Nathan seems like a perfectly reasonable name, and I'll give it my email address. I will give it a password, so this is just sort of the stock thing. So you can see it created a bunch of tables here when I ran the syncdb command, but I don't see my contacts table here. I don't see anything I see something called users, but I don't see anything that said contacts, and so that makes me suspicious and sad. And so here's what's going on. If you look in your address book, but I will note that now you see there's an addresses.db file here. So it created my database for me, but it does not appear to have created my contacts. That's a bummer. So in the address book project, remember we have the settings file? We're going to go in there and change one other thing. If you look for installed in all capital letters, you'll see this installed apps tuple. This tells Django what applications make up your project. So you can have some Python code on the path installed, but it's not actually part of your project until you tell Django about it. And by default, there's a few things it includes here, like Django auth, Django content types and sessions. So this is where those other tables came from when we ran syncdb. So we need to tell it about our contacts application. So I'm just going to add another line here. And these are strings for like the Python package name as a string. So I'm just going to add contacts to my list of installed apps. What's that? Can you have an empty entry? An empty installed apps? Oh, you mean, so let me make sure I understand the question. You mean like that? So the question is, can I have an empty string here? The answer is no. And the reason is, Python or Django, when it goes to start things up, either for the shell or for the server or something, it's going to look at each one of these strings, and it's effectively going to do an import blank. So import django.contrib.auth, import django.contrib.content types, and import nothing is not valid Python. So you have to have, it has to be in a package, and that package needs to have a models.py. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to run syncdb again. So I'm going to run manage.py syncdb. And so you'll note that it went a lot faster this time. And now we have this, we have a line of output here where it says we created our new table, contacts contact. So there's two things to note about this. First of all, it ran a lot faster because once you sync a model to the database, Django doesn't, Django's not going to try and sync it again. It's not going to keep up with changes. There's something called South that helps you do that. If you were in Ashish and Karen's tutorial this morning, you used South from the beginning. We're not going to use it this afternoon, but that's sort of a way to manage that. But the second thing to note here is the way it named your table. So by default, it's going to take the application name and the class name, mush them to lowercase. That's the technical term is mush, and join them with an underscore. So at this point, I have this table in my database, and I can actually, I haven't written any web code, but I can actually interact with it and sort of see how the Django ORM works. So I'm going to use, I'm going to run Python manage.py shell. So if you've used the Python interactive console before, this is basically the interactive console with some Django bits baked in. And you can't, you actually sort of have to, or it's easier to, if you want to interact with your code, to use this shell as opposed to the normal one, because it sets up, sort of tells Django where your database is, it knows where the settings, what settings you're using, and goes from there. So at this point I can do, from contacts.models import contact, and I can do something like this, contact.create, first name is equal to Nathan, if I can spell my own name. Oh, contact.objects.create. So it so I can kind of see I'm making a contact here. I can do contact.objects.all, and I'm going to get back a list of them. I can also, so let me create another one here. And you can see if I do contacts.all, I get 2 of them back now. So what is this .objects thing? So what we've made so far in our code is a model, and every model has a manager associated with it. And if you think of the model if the model object corresponds to the rows in the table, the manager corresponds to operating on the table as a whole. So you can do things like contact.objects.filter. First name is equal to Jason, objects plural, and you can see I'm actually querying the database and only returning contacts that have a first name of Jason. There's also things like I'm gonna get myself into trouble here, but I think this is right. Yeah, so you can also do like starts with. So there's a lot of different operators here you can use. And note that all of my fields, so all my fields on my model, become keyword arguments that I can use when I go to create or filter. And then Django uses the double underscore to separate the field name from an operator, or the field name from a traversed field name we'll see later too. So there's about 24 of these different types of ways to filter things. You can do case-insensitive comparison, greater than equal than. Basically all the SQL comparisons you can do with this syntax. The interesting thing here is that, or another interesting thing to me, is that even though this looks like it's returning a list of contacts, if I do type of objects.filter, you'll see that I'm actually getting back this thing called a query set. So a query set is like a list in Python, but it doesn't actually load all the data until you need it. And you can do things like you can start chaining things and you can pass these around. And so this actually gives you a lot of power and composability as you start working on things where if I do contacts.objects.all, contact.objects.all. So here, this is a query set containing all my contacts, but then I can chain this and I can say filter first name is equal to Nathan. Well, now I get another query set back. I can filter this again. Last name is Smith. Well, now I don't get anything back. So this looks like a contrived example, but it's really important to recognize that when you're making these operations, you're getting back this query set object that you're able to chain and to continue to refine, because it's going to make doing sort of larger scale SQL things in the ORM more straightforward. So at this point, we have a model, it has a string method, it's sort of boring, but I want to write a test. And the reason I want to write a test is because this under stir that we created gets exposed in a lot of different places in Django, and it's something that's easy to test. And writing a test lets me know when my application breaks or when things change as I continue to do more with it. If you asked Carl at this point, he would say I've done things in the wrong order, that I should have written the test first. And Carl, as usual, is right. But I'm up here and Carl is not. So we're writing the test second today. So if you, inside of your contacts application, there's a test.py that it created for you. And you can see that by default, it just has a doc string and this simple test where we have a test case. So this is sort of how tests are created. Every method starts with test in its name, and then there's these assert calls that you make, where you make assertions about the state of the world. So this one simply tests that 1 + 1 is really 2. If I was going to write a test, so I want to write a test for my my under stir method, and so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to first from contacts .models import contact, and I'm going to make a new test case. So test case here is, you can see we've imported it from Django. This is actually almost the same as the unit test framework in Python. So if you're familiar with that, this should be really familiar. So let's see, I want to test that when I make a contact, that its string representation is really its first and last name. So I'm going to say C is equal to contact. And then I'm going to say self.assert equal stir of C, Joe Smith. So when we were working in the shell, we were always creating our models using contact.objects.create. And that's actually sort of doing two things at once. It's making the object in memory, and it's saving it to the database right away. In this case, I don't actually need to test that my database saving works. I have full faith that Django has tested that well, and that they're taking care of that for me. So I can make this in memory by simply instantiating the class, and I don't actually need to interact with the database. So if I have that test created, again, the manage command has this test subcommand, and what manage.py test does is it prints a dot for every test that it runs, which is shocking at this point because I swear that there's only 2 tests in that file, the one I wrote and the one that it put in there before, that 1 + 1 is 2. And what's happening here is, oh, this is really exciting. When I wrote the document, it was 420 tests, now it's 480. The world was getting better. So what's happening is Django is running the tests for all of your installed apps at once. A lot of times you're just working on one, so you'll only want to run that particular one. So you can say, oh, we'll run it on test. I just want to test the contacts app. And you can see how I got 2 tests, ran much, much faster, and things are reasonable. So, yes. Say that again? Can you give it a regular expression? Sure. So the question is, for the assertion statement in the test, can you give it a regular expression? You absolutely can. So I'm using, let's just open that up again here. So while these both use assert equal, there's a whole host of assert methods you can call to do different kinds of assertions. So you can do self.assert true, and then use Python's built-in regular expression module to sort of test that it matches that. There's an assert false for those cases. There's an assert not equal. There's also I don't think there's an assert matches, but if you go and look at the Django testing doc and the Python unit test standard library, you'll see that there's a bunch of different options. Let me see here. So this is very slow, so I may show this in a moment, but does that answer your question? Yeah, so it can be any kind of expression. Thank you so much. I forgot to mention that. So let's go and look. So creating test database for alias default. This is actually really important, so thank you for asking what this meant. Basically, when you write unit tests, you may want to create data as you go. You may want to delete data to test something. You may want to do all sorts of data operations. And it would sure be nice if that didn't muck with the site that you're actually deploying or that you actually want to work with. Or if you have a pointing at your production database, it would sure be a bummer if you ran the test to make sure the world is good and it dropped a bunch of tables. So what Django does for you is it basically does a syncdb before it runs any tests, and gives you a new database using the same backend that you've got configured, and it's completely empty or just has some basic fixture data loaded into it. And then at the end of the test run, it tears it down and deletes it. So as a result, your tests are sort of isolated. You know that you're starting from a clean world and that your tests are going to be deterministic. This is actually really important because we have some tests, we had in the past some tests that would do things like look at our QA database and count the number of events a particular user had. And this worked great in a lot of cases, but there were also cases where somebody had been trying to reproduce a bug and gone and created another event, and now all of a sudden this test failed because it's getting back the wrong number of events. And that takes time, takes our attention away from real problems. So running in isolation is super important. The other thing Django is going to do for you is if you use fixtures, which are a way to sort of load basic data to start with, it's going to reset those fixtures after every test case so that my test cases don't interfere with each other. Is that satisfactory? Okay. Yes.
Questions on the models. We had, all and filter and
Yep. Oh yeah.
kind of things. Is that unique to Django, or did that come from some other implementation and other frameworks?
Sure. So the question is, when we're working with the model manager, and we say things, we have like all, and we have filter, we have create, we have all these different methods, and if that's unique to Django or from something else. Many of these sort of higher level frameworks have similar concepts, but they spell it differently. So if you were looking at a framework that used SQL Alchemy or use some other object relational mapper, most of them are going to have a way to write your query as in a Pythonic syntax as opposed to SQL, but it's not going to be .objects.filter. Yeah, exactly. So the concepts are common, the spelling is not. So, okay. So just sort of like as a point of really brief review about models, we've seen we make a model out of fields. We run syncdb to create it in the database. There's models have a manager as objects, the .objects, and you can override that if you need to add some things we'll see later. And we wrote a unit test to make sure that our stir method works. And before we move on, I just want to demonstrate that this test actually, so here's the reason you should write your tests first as you get used to this. Because right now, I don't actually know that my test works. I just know that it passes, and I don't actually know that it's testing the thing I want to test. Like, I think it does because I wrote the tutorial, and I have not been accused of humility, but so I'm pretty confident, but I just want to make sure this. And so I'm going to just demonstrate really quickly that if I were to go in here and, oops. So I'm going to change what stir does. And you can just sort of watch this. So now stir is going to return the first name. And now if I run the tests, I get a failure. And now I know that this is actually testing. So now you can see it tells me exactly what went wrong here. It got Joe, and it expected Joe Smith. So this is the sort of error message that's really helpful to be able to read. Oops. I don't know why I look over there when I have it right in front of me. So, and now I can see that things pass again. So we've created some database we've created some data in our database, and we have a model for it, and we have a test for that model. But we haven't actually touched HTTP, which is sort of the whole reason we're here. And so we're going to talk about views now. And a view in Django. So the way I think about a view is it's something that takes an HTTP request and turns it into a response. And if your view is doing a lot of data processing or a lot of sort of decision making, that's usually sort of a sign that maybe it's going to be, maybe things need to be moved around a little bit or refactored. And yes?
I kind of missed the point of
I'm sorry.
the forced failure. Are you saying purposely make a bad code first and then run the test?
Well, maybe, so sure, so the question, and thanks for interrupting me, the question, or because this actually is important. So the question is, what's the point of the forced failure? And am I advocating that you write bad code first and then a test for it and then write it to fix it? So I'm not advocating you write bad code first, but if you think, so an alternate way to think about this is if I had not written that stir method at all and I wrote the test for it first, it would have failed right out of the gate. And so the point of the failing, of sort of the forced failures, is to demonstrate that I was actually in this case, is to demonstrate I was actually testing what I thought I was testing, and that I didn't just have maybe my assertions incorrect, and so that just looked like a pass, because an empty test will always pass, right? So if you're fixing a bug, so like, let's think about this, instead of writing new code, think about fixing bugs. A really great way to approach fixing bugs in web apps or any application is to write a test that reproduces the bug. So if you can see if you know what the error or the bug triggers, and then you can write a test that sort of does that automatically, now you know that you fixed it as soon as your test starts passing. So it's just sort of, by seeing it fail first, you know that you're able to reproduce this error situation. You're able to reproduce what the problem is before you actually attempt to fix it. So I'm not sure that's actually helping as an explanation.
Well, actually, I heard of methodology where you write all the tests first,
sure,
and then start writing the app.
So you're talking about test-driven development,
Yeah.
and that's actually.
Not what you're trying to demonstrate.
I'm demonstrating sort of the very half-assed version of test-driven development. So, I heard test-inspired development. I have a microphone, so I'm going to claim that as my own. I practice TID, test-inspired development. Thank you. So I guess I want to talk about views now, and particularly around Django's generic and class-based views. If you were in Karen's tutorial this morning, you saw how you could write a view as a Python function. So, and a view very generically is any Python callable that takes a request and returns a response. So it's pretty simple in that respect. But Django has this idea of generic views, and these are views for things that are maybe common starting points, where you want to list objects in a database, or you want to edit an object or create an object. And what they realized is that people were writing a lot of boilerplate code as they did applications. We are in chapter 3, if you're following along. So they were writing a lot of boilerplate code. So they had introduced the idea of generic views. And in 1.3, they introduced this idea of class-based generic views, which further streamlines things. So we're going to start building out some views and building tests for views so that we can make sure that we understand how things are working. And we're going to use those class-based views. So I have, I'm going to close that. I'm going to do that. And right, so this is, we're going to type this in a moment, but this is sort of the simplest class-based view you can imagine. It is the Django class, its subclass is view, and it has a get and a post. You don't have to type this. We're actually not going to type this version. This is just sort of how they look. So you can see it takes a request when you do a get, and it returns a response. That's really all there is to it. And this name, get, maps to the HTTP method name that when you do an HTTP get. So it's not too much of a leap to imagine that if you were doing a post or a delete or a head, you can add methods for each one of those to your class and keep all this code together, but have it route directly where you want to go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work on this list view of our contacts. And the Django list view provides a view of a list of things. And there's a few things it does for you by default that we don't have to do anything with. So like you can override it and tell it what the query set is, what the context data looks like, what the context data looks like again, because I apparently have a typo, and what the template is. So I'm going to switch over to the terminal, and we're actually going to write this view. So in our contacts app, we have a views.py, which right now contains the helpful instruction, create your views here. I shall. So, so these views live in Django.views.generic. So I'm going to import list view. And since I'm showing a view of my contact model, I also need to import that. So that's in contacts.models, import contact. I am practicing absolute imports for future sanity. So I'm going to create a new class here, which is my contact list view. And I'm going to tell it what model I want to use. So believe it or not, I could actually stop right here and I have a functioning view. I haven't wired it up, but this will actually do something. So that seems pretty lightweight. I kind of like that. So we need to actually tell it how to get to this view though. And that's going to require us to work in the address book project, the urls.py. So this is one of those files that start project created for us. And like the other ones, it has a bunch of sort of boilerplate here. But this is where you tell Django, hey, when you get a request that matches this pattern, go load this Python code and execute it for me and return the result. Okay? So these examples are not that useful. So I'm just going to go right here. And so there's this URL call, there's this URL function, and it takes a few things. One of them is a regular expression. And this is the regular expression that is going to match the URL on. So in this case, I'm saying an empty, start, finish, empty. So this is sort of the default view for my application. And then I'm going to say contacts.views list contact view. And I'm actually going to go and cheat and look over here at my, of course I named it like the opposite here. Contact, list view, whatever. So we're going to do it this way. Name equals contacts list. So, so let's look at each of these pieces, each of these parameters in order. We first have the regular expression. In this case, I said this is going to match just the base / the root view. And then we tell Django what we actually want to run. If you were doing sort of traditional views that are just callables, you could just put the callable here. So the function. So this is a class-based view. I have to do this .as view, which basically returns back something that Django can route to, and will handle that dispatch for you to the different method names. And then you have name equals contacts list. And this name basically says, here's a logical identifier, here's a way to identify this URL other than the actual URL, so that when I want to link to this, I can specify by name as opposed to the actual href. And this gets really useful whenever you're building reusable apps, because the URL might not be the same between uses, right? You might plug it into /contacts for an address book, but maybe it's /group/members if I'm using this to make a group management application. And I can change these URLs, and if I refer to them by this name, then the rest of my application just sort of works. And I don't have to actually go back through and change my templates up. So we'll see how this gets used in just a moment. I have to do import contacts.views here, since I'm actually using that inside of the URL patterns. So this is sort of a note to the TAs. If people need to get caught up right now, they can check out a git tag of contact underscore list underscore view. It's very cleverly named, and rerun and reactivate the virtual env, and they'll be caught up. Yeah, if you want this, I have a little cheat sheet here. So I've defined my URL. I've made the simplest possible view I can. So let's fire it up and see if it works. So once again, manage.py. There's a run server, and this is a built-in server that Django has with it for testing your application. You should never use this in production. It will fall over. Awful things will happen, but it's great for sort of trying things out. So once I run it, I can look at this localhost 8000. Let me make that not full screen. So I'm at localhost 8000 right now, and I have a syntax error, which is sad, but it's kind of great that Django actually responded to my request, so I'm getting there. Oh, and it's actually my views. It's in my views file, not my URLs file. So let's go look at that. Oh yeah, you need a colon in Python. So now if I refresh this, yes, now I get a completely different error. And this is that template does not exist. And this is basically Django is trying to help us out and guess what our template should be called, but we haven't actually created that template, and we actually don't want to create it there, so we're gonna manually override this. But you can see that it's actually loaded our view, and if you go down here, you can actually see that you maybe can't see. Let me make that big so I can see. Okay, you can't see it actually. Sorry. But anyway, it's trying to find this particular template for us. So in my contacts application, I have my models, my tests, my views, and Django by default, when it looks for templates, it's going to look in it for a templates directory inside of each one of these, inside of each one of your applications. So I'm going to make a contacts templates directory. And I'm going to make a new file in there called contact_list.html. So, and I'm just going to put some HTML in here to render this contact list. So, I'm going to do it as a bulleted list here. So Django templates look a lot like HTML. Yes? Why was it looking for so the question I think is why was it looking for contact list.html? So the generic views basically try to make it as easy as possible to get up and going. And so they're going to, if you don't tell it what template to use, it's going to try and infer what you meant. And so in this case, this gets generated because contacts is our application name, contact is our model name, and we have a list view. If we had started out with an edit view, it would be looking for contacts, contact_edit.html. So it's going to try and infer that for you. We're going to override it and tell it explicitly what one we want to use. The other interesting thing here, though, now since we're talking about this, is that in the template loader post-mortem, it's going to show you, it's going to try and like, hey, I tried to look in these places. And I couldn't find what you want. I'm really sorry and apologetic, but I'm going to have to error. So Django templates are HTML, and then they have these extra tags that you can put in for certain control things. These are usually either a double curly brace or a curly %. So in this case, it's a curly %, and it's for contact in I'm going to do for contact in object list. And since HTML doesn't enforce indentation the way Python does, you actually have to say where your for loop ends. So let's talk about this. So what we're doing here is we have this object list, which is a query set, and we're going to iterate over it and assign contact to each version. And then the double curly means substitute this variable at this point. So because contact is an object, this is actually calling that double understir that we created early on and as part of our model. So the question here is how did I know that this was object list? Where did that object list come from? It's it's not magic, but it feels like it sometimes. This is again Django's views trying to provide you with sort of default things. When you're doing these generic views, if you're doing something that looks at a single object, it provides a variable that's cunningly named object. And if you're doing a view that works on a whole set of objects, it calls it object list. And so these are just conventions. In Django 1.3 and 4, this was sort of awful because, no, it was awful. Because you actually had to go and look at the source code and figure out what it was doing. Django 1.5 shipped like a week and a half ago, something like that. And one of the things that I'm most excited about is that the documentation for class-based views and generics is so much better. And so you can actually go now and look at those docs, and it shows you exactly what variables are exposed in the view. And maybe at the break I'll try and pull that up, and so I can show you where you would find that if you want to go look at it yourself as you're using these. Did I see a question in the back? Okay. Yes.
Sorry, did you have to make this template?
I did, yes. So I made a templates directory inside of my contacts application, and by default, Django is going to look for a templates directory inside of each one of your applications. There's actually, if you decide for some reason that you want to override all your templates and put them in a directory off by themselves, you can tell Django explicitly, hey, only look in these directories. I like to keep them sort of with the Python code so that I have everything for that particular application altogether. Yes?
Sorry, just as a follow-up on that, if you had a different kind of view, like that would determine the default names of files inside the template?
Yeah, so what we're going to see here in just a moment is actually the names inside of templates are completely in our control.
Oh.
So it would influence what Django uses as the default if you don't specify. I find the defaults to be, I forget what the defaults are. And so we're going to see it's one line of code to tell it what it is, and then when you look at the view, you can tell, oh, this is the file. This is the file for me. This is the one I want. So this is contactlist.html. I'm going to go ahead and open up contacts views again. And right under model, I'm going to say that my template name is contactlist.html. So, so you omit the templates part because it looks in there by default, but this tells you explicitly, this is the template I'm using, and now when you go and look at this view, when you come back to this in a month or a week or whatever, you don't really have to think about that.
You could make that contact.
Yeah, so yes, you could call that contacts.html, you could call it all the contacts.html, you can, whatever you want at this point. So if I save this and I fire up my run server again, aha, huzzah. I have my contacts heading, and these are the two contacts that I created earlier when I was in the interactive shell and I was using objects.create. Is the break at 253? Maybe one of my TAs can find out and tell me. Okay, great. So we're going to do something else yet, and then we'll take a break. So this, as delightful as this is, having to create our contacts in the interactive shell and then view them in a web browser is a bit pedestrian. So I want to add functionality that lets me actually create these. And I'm going to do this again with another one of these generic class-based views because they do a lot of this work for me. So I open up contacts views again. In addition to
So the object list is something that you got deriving from this view.
that's right. So the question is the object list something that I got from deriving from list view? That's absolutely correct. And so because list view, you can kind of tell by its name, it operates on a set of objects. It's or a list of things. And we're going to see here in just a moment that when we do a create view, we have an object, not an object list, because it's only we're operating on one of them. So I had this slide that may be useful in the future to you, which is basically you could, if you wanted to override that and make it something other than object list, you could override this get context object name method and basically return whatever you want. So this is sort of the class-based view pattern where you inherit from something that has a lot of defaults, and as you need to customize it, as you need to extend it, you can override these methods just as you need to, and it provides a lot of composability. So, so in addition to my list view, I'm going to import the create view. And I'm going to add a new class, create contact view, that subclasses from that. So a lot of this looks really similar. I'm just going to go ahead and tell it right up front that my template name is editcontact.html. So one of the other things that using class-based views gives you is it enforces some best practices around HTTP methods. So you may, if you've done other web work in the past, you may know that it's basically a get, so an HTTP get on a document, that when you just type in a URL and get it, it should not mutate data on the back end. The best practice is that you shouldn't do that, because that lets people trick you and trick your users into following a link and having some side effect. And when you submit a form, that should be, that's a post, and that's when you actually mutate data. But the best practice is that you post and then you redirect, so you do a get. And that way, if the user refreshes the view, they're not resubmitting their edit, they're not potentially overriding things. And so class-based views actually enforce this by saying, when I'm doing something where I'm going to mutate data, I'm going to do get to get the form, and then when I post it, I'm going to redirect to a success URL if everything goes swimmingly. And that success URL could be whatever you want, but it's going to force you to do this, and that's a good thing in my opinion. So there's this get success URL, success URL method we overwrite. And I think my indentation is off here. Oops. Okay, so So remember when I said earlier that by giving your URLs a name, you can sort of refer to them by that name as opposed to by their actual URL. So I'm going to do that right here. I'm going to use this function called reverse. And I do need to import that. Resolve res, import reverse. Okay, so what this is going to do is, it's when it gets to that reverse, it's going to take that contacts list string and it's going to go through your the project's URLs. So remember, the project is what you're actually deploying. It's not part of the application, and it's going to look for the one named contacts list so that we can send people back there after they've completed their creating their contact. And we need to make a template for this. So we're going to make that in contacts templates. I called that edit contact.html. So this one is a little bit, before we just had a loop over things. We didn't actually need to do that much. We need to do a little bit more here. So I'm going to give it a title. So what I'm doing here is so Django has this, we've looked at models and we looked at views. There's this third thing called forms that take user input and turn it into Python objects and validate it for you. And they also have the nice side effect of having enough information to be able to render an HTML form for you. And so when we're doing these create views or the edit views, these ones that mutate data, Django's actually creating a form for us behind the scenes that we don't have to know about, but we still need to put it into our template. So there's a few little bits here we need. First of all, we need a CSRF token. CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery. And basically, it's an attack people make on web applications, trying to get you to click a link, on Twitter that actually goes to your bank and sends a check to them, or a more pedestrian example, that you click a link on some innocuous-looking site and it posts something to your Facebook wall. Those are examples of the sort of attacks you can mount with a cross-site request forgery. And so Django by default protects against those by requiring that every time you do a form that you have this token in the form that's specific to your site. And so it makes it more difficult to mount those sort of attacks. So this CSRF token tag inserts that for us. And then I'm going to do form.asUL. So, and one more thing, and then we'll talk about it. So, just like we had the object list before, we have a form. We have a form in our context here that has the fields that we're going to edit in it, and the forms you can output them as tables, as paragraph tags. I'm doing it as an unordered list, and sort of the thing they all have in common is that they render the guts. They don't render the container. So if I'm doing render as UL, I still have to put the UL tag around it, or if I'm doing as table, I'd have to put the table tag around it. It's just going to give me the table rows. This lets you kind of put whatever header or footer around your inputs that you want to. The other thing that's interesting here is that as UL is actually a method on the form, but you notice we don't put parentheses around it like we're calling a method. And the reason is that in Django templates, they've tried to strip away as much complexity as they can so that people who are non-technical or non-Python engineers, I guess, can maybe work on templates or write them. And so what it does is when it encounters a code like this, it's going to look at the form object. It's going to look for as UL. And if that's callable, if it's a method, it's going to call it for you. If it's a property, it's just going to output that property. If it doesn't exist, it's going to try and do this as a dictionary access. So it has this whole chain of fallbacks that they all get spelled the same inside of the form. But so that's just sort of something to know. You couldn't, if you tried to put the parens here, that's invalid syntax in a Django template. Yeah. So the question is, what if you needed to pass arguments? And that would be a really sad day, wouldn't it? So the short answer is you can't. If you have some, it's sad. I didn't say why it was sad, it's just sad. So if you have some sort of helper function that you need to pass some arguments into, the Django solution is that you write your own template tag. And the template tag can take arguments. So an example of that, let me delete that. An example of that is this URL tag up here. So contacts-new is an argument to the URL tag. And this is basically the same as the reverse function that we just saw in our view, except it's saying I want to post this to my new contact view that I'm gonna set up. So if you're using Django templates, you have to write your own tag to pass arguments. Lots of people decide they don't like Django templates and they want to rip it out and put something else in there. That's totally doable. You can, lots of people use Jinja too because it looks similar. We use Mako with Django at Eventbrite. I even worked on a project that used Zope page templates with Django, which is sort of this awful combination, but you can basically there's hooks now to do all that sort of customization if you need to do that, if you need to reach that low level. So there's just one more thing to do before we can see this in action, and that is add it as a URL. So again, we're adding the regular expression, and I'm just going to call that new and put the $sign there. So if I didn't put the $sign to say that this is the end of the path, this would match anything that started with new, which is not what I want. I want to be really explicit that I only want this to match the new URL. And this is again in contacts.views. Create contact view as view. And it has a name, contacts new. And that's the same, remember that's the same string we saw in that URL tag inside of the template for it to post to. So if I run the server, and I go back here and I look at this, well, the list still works like we expect it to. And if I go to /new, oh, bummer. This is actually fantastic. Could not parse the remainder. The syntax of URL changed in Django 1.5. See the docs. So we're almost at the break time, so I'm just going to hack this, and then we'll come back and I'll figure out during the break what's actually going on. What's that? Contacts new has to be quoted. Huzzah. So you see I have the first and last in email here, and I didn't actually type that. That's all derived from the form, and which is also derived from my contact model. If I try to do, so I can do something here like Ashish. And so I can do an example here that doesn't have an email. Oh, actually these fields are required, so it's actually going to show me these errors. And if I try to put something here that's like not an email address, enter a valid email address. So you see that it's actually deriving some validation rules for me from my model and from my field setup here. And there you go. So when you're able to successfully adding, it sends you back to the list on completion. So we're at the midway point. We're gonna take a 20-minute break. Be back. So we're gonna be back at 3. It's 10 till 3 right now. We'll be back at 3:10, and we'll continue with some more generic views and building out some tests for these views. I understand. Is that what you want? So we're going to get started here again in just a second. I wanted to find for people the documentation as promised, both in the first half and also to some people during the break. So docs.djangoproject.com. There's this whole section here on class-based views. The API reference, excuse me, is, let me make this larger. So this is what's been updated in for 1.5. So here's the API reference for the list view that we've been using. And you can see, so this is sort of what made these so complex and powerful and sometimes confusing in earlier versions. You can see that there's like half a dozen things that it's subclassing here to make this all work. And those are all, you can navigate to those. But then here, this is really helpful. It has this method flowchart. So when we do that list view, this is what's actually happening. It's calling dispatch. It might check method not allowed if we don't support the HTTP method. It's going to figure out what the template name is, the query set, the object, context object names. And then finally, it's going to call get, which is, handles the actual call. So most of these generic views have a similar method flowchart. And then, and the other thing they have is the paragraph up here. While the some stuff about what you can count on being available on the class. So this is actually a really great reference now for figuring out how these class-based views work. So, well, yes. So the question is there any community forums or anything? And are you referring to Django generally or class-based views in particular? Generally, yeah. So there's a pretty active mailing list. There's also a very active IRC channel that is usually pretty good for at least getting some pointers in the right direction about things. It's been my experience. And depending on where you are geographically, there are Django meetups that happen where you can a lot of times talk to people who have been doing. That's some place when I started doing this, I like to go to find people who have been doing this longer than I have. So that's another option. So when we last left off, we had this list view. We were able to create contacts. Oh, I don't have my server running. Right, so we were able to create contacts. This is all well and good, but how do we test these things? Or how do we make sure they don't break over time now that we've spent all this energy putting them together? So we're going to pause with our view writing and talk about some of the testing tools that Django has available for writing tests for your views. So there's three things. There are three tools that you should be aware of, and we're going to talk about two of them in the interest of time. So there's this thing called the test client, which is a way to make requests against your application inside of a unit test. And we're not going to talk about that one, and the reason is that it significantly overlaps with the other two, and in my opinion, it's sort of the least interesting. So and I'll tell you one in a moment. So the second one is called the request factory, which is a way to make a request object, pass it through your view, and test what happens to it. We're going to show that one. And the other one's called the live server test case, which actually fires up your entire project and lets you write an application. And the reason we're not going to talk about the test client is it sits somewhere between the two of these, and so it's not really clear if you're writing a unit test or an integration test, and they are slow, which is fine when you have 5 tests, but when you have 5,000, that actually matters. And they in my opinion, they're just more difficult to maintain. So So we're going to open up. So we're going to open up our contacts tests file here, and I'm going to go down to the bottom. And so the test I'm going to write here, I'm going to write a test case for the list view, and the thing I want to test when I'm writing a unit test for a view like this is I want to test that the data I expect winds up in the context, because if that changes, my templates break, and I don't have a good way of knowing, where that view template barrier is, and or that where that communication is. I don't have a really good way of testing that, and so I want to make sure that I'm really aware of it if that changes, and that I can go and update my templates, right? So tests are really about giving yourself confidence so that when you start making changes to your application, that you know when you've changed the behavior, and then you can decide either that you've introduced a bug and you need to fix it, or that your test is no longer valid and you need to think for a moment about what else that might influence. So in the case of this list view, if I stop getting the object list for some reason, or it doesn't have the information I expect in it, I've got to think, have I introduced a bug, or does my template need to change? So let's write this test. I'm going to add an import. So I'm going to from Django, from Django.test.client import request factory. If you, for those of you more amenable to copying and pasting, we are in the writing views section of the tutorial, down here in testing your views. And so I'm going to make a new class here. I'm going to make a contact list view tests test case. And I'm going to make this view called test contacts in context. So Django, when you're working with a Django template, the context is all of the data that's available for your template to be rendered against. So when we made our list template, we had object list. That object list is coming from the context. When we had our create contact view, that form variable that we're referring to, that's part of the context as well. So in this case, I care about what the context is, so I want to check this out. So, so the first thing I'm going to do is make a request factory.
How do you spell the factory?
I spell it with a T. What do you think I am, mad? So the request factory is just a way to make request objects. And I hope that's clear what that means in just a moment here. So I'm going to say request is equal to factory.get /. So this .get is just kind of like a class-based views. It's an HTTP method name. And the slash here actually doesn't matter, and I'll tell you why in a moment. That could be, gobbledygook, blarf. It's totally fine. Then I'm going to say response is equal to, I called this the contact list view, didn't I? I did. So this part of the line should look familiar. This looks a whole lot like what we put in the URLs, right? We put contact list view .as view in our URL declarations. And if you remember when we looked at sort of the basic view, if you remember that if we look at the simplest view, it takes a request as an argument. So this is a case where we're getting the actual view object and we're passing this request in directly to it. So we're completely bypassing the URL routing. The URLs don't matter at this point. We're bonking directly on this object. And this response that I get back it's kind of like an HTTP response, but it has some extra stuff on there that helps me test things. So So for example, I can say self assert equals response. So I have this context data that is a dictionary that corresponds to the things that are available in my view. So remember, this should sort of seem familiar that there's object list, and I'm basically looking at this, and so I'm going to reformat this just a little bit here. So if I cast that to a list, I expect that to be equal to the empty list. And I expect that to be true because the database is empty at this point. So if I go to look at my list view, there should be no contacts in it. So that's sort of the first test case. And I'm actually going to duplicate this here. Call this, so these are really two separate test cases. There's no contacts in the context when it's empty, and when there are. So if I make a contact here, and I assign it to C. So in this case, I expect there to be exactly one contact in my list, and I expect it to actually be equal to this one that I just created here. So I'm looking at this, and I also need to, from contacts.views, import contact list view. Okay, so I've got two test cases. One of them is the sort of empty case, sort of the base set, where I expect it's going to be empty when there's no data, and this other one where I've created a contact, and I expect it to be in my object list when I go to look at this template. Oh, and my VI yank skills are rusty, so I'm missing a parens. Cool. So I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to do Python manage.py test contacts. So that seems pretty great. So this is how you can write a view, or I'm sorry, this is how you can write a test that exercises your view directly. So you're not testing the URL routing, you're not testing the database in this case, although we are using it. You're really focused on this view logic and making sure that the thing you expect to be coming out of the view is what it is. So in this case, we looked at context data. You can also look at what the template name used was, and you can sort of test these things as it makes sense for your application. So this is sort of the unit testing approach where you want to test like one thing in particular. There's also this idea of integration tests where you want to test things end to end. And you actually do want to test that your URL configuration works correctly, and you do want to test that your database is set up correctly, and that, like testing the pieces is great. It makes you feel good that the pieces are constructed the way you want them to be, but if those pieces don't actually plug together the right way, it's an uninteresting result. And for this, we have something called the live server test case. And this is something that Django added in 1.4 that makes it really straightforward. I'm not sure it's easy, but it's straightforward at least, to write these tests that test everything from end to end. And so we're gonna write one of these for our create contact view. The thing to be aware of is that this live server test case is not enough on its own. You have to combine it with another package. So The live server test case sort of does what it says on the box. It gives you a live server to test against. But you have to have a way to actually utilize that. So we're going to use something called Selenium to do that. And Selenium is a package that lets you drive a web browser as if a user was there and do it in an automated fashion and test what the result is. So from the command line here, I'm just going to quickly do pip install Selenium. Or not quickly, as it were. And while that is working, I'm going to switch over here to the other terminal, and I'm going to open up contacts tests again. So, so up until now, we've been subclassing from test case when we write our tests. This one has a different superclass. We need to import that, and we also need to import our WebDriver that actually drives the browser. So I've tested this with Firefox. I know it will work with Chrome, but requires additional setup. So if you're using Chrome, I apologize. And I will help you afterwards if you would like to get this going. But this, I'm going to show you how to do it with Firefox, and your mileage may vary. So I'm going to import the live server test case. And from selenium.webdriver.firefox.webdriver. So you can you can imagine what this import would look like if you were doing Chrome. Import WebDriver. So I'm going to make a new test case here. And here's the first thing that's going to be different. Class method. I'm going to have a setup class method and a teardown class method. So the unit test framework lets you run code before and after your unit tests. It also lets you run code before you start any of your unit tests. So that's what this is here. This is a setup class. And what we have to do is we have to set up our Selenium integration here. So Selenium is equal to WebDriver. So this is the Firefox WebDriver we've imported. And then we're going to call the superclass. The superclass's setup class. Create contact integration test. So this is just normal Python stuff. And then when we tear down, when we're done running our test, we're going to see this is actually going to start a web browser for us. And so we would like to not leave a dozen web browsers lying around. So we'll call that, and then we'll call teardown. And just for fun, we'll spell this correctly. So, so this is sort of the boilerplate you need to get this started. If you're going to write a lot of these, you might have your own, test case that you subclass from. And so now I'm going to make an add contact test. So you'll see what we're going to do here is we're going to, new. So Django gives us this self.live server URL that is the, basically points to where your live server lives. And by default, that's going to be like localhost port 9000, but you can actually tell Django to start me a couple of these, and then it will pass them out to the different tests as they run. You can also do this. You can also say, hey, run my tests against my QA instance over here, so that I'm actually running it against sort of a more production-like environment. So it's pretty useful. But so we're gonna get the /new view, which you remember is our create contact. And then we're going to do Selenium find element by ID, first name, dot send keys, Joey. So what this is doing here is it's finding an element in the page with the ID. Django forms are actually really nice in one respect in that they give you consistent, predictable IDs for things. So you can make this sort of assumption that it's going to be ID underscore first name. And then we're saying send keys. And we're going to basically type Joey in for the first name. And then we're going to do the same thing here for the last name. And we're going to do the same thing for the email. So, so we're going to send those keys, and then we're going to, oops. So now we've typed in our form, and now we need to actually click. We need to click the submit button. So we're going to do Selenium find element by XPath. So I didn't give my ID or my submit button an ID, so I can't use that method here. I could go back and add an ID now, but Selenium also supports XPath, which is a way of sort of addressing into the DOM. So I know that I'm looking for the input that has the attribute type of submit. And I need to fix my quotes. So I'm finding the submit button, and I am going to call click on it, which will bonk on the submit button. So at this point, I've done a bunch of stuff, but I haven't actually tested anything, and so or haven't made any assertions. And so what I'm just going to test, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to go off script, so we'll see how this goes, and I'm going to test that this actually exists in the database. I think that's kind of interesting. Self.assert equal contact.objects dot all. So basically, I assume there's going to be one contact in there, and I'm going to assert that it's Joey. Make sense? So let's see. Okay, Selenium is successfully installed. Let's see what happens. What's that? Oh, thanks, Selenium. You can either run your code and find your bugs, or you can have your friends help you with it. It's really, really effective. Thank you. Right. So let's see what happens. Whoa. Huzzah! Well, kind of. But this is actually really great because the error is just my absolute inability to pluralize things. So I can run it again. There we go. So this is really powerful for testing the way your entire application or your entire project works together and testing it from end to end. But it is brittle, right? So if you changed, so say like we added another submit button for some other form on that page, well, that find by XPath isn't going to work anymore because that expression changed. Or if we changed some ID that we were using in the DOM, I'd have to update the test as well. So there's some brittleness there, but there's also a lot of power in testing things end to end. Yes?
If you have a whole truckload of unit tests and unit tests, they all go to this one test.py module?
Okay, so the question is, if I have a whole truckload, and I hope I do, of unit and integration tests, do they all go into this test.py model? Absolutely not. I'm putting them there sort of for expediency and the fact that we have 3 hours together. I highly suggest that if, as you grow it, past more than a dozen, that you start thinking about splitting them out, turning that into a Python package rather than a module. So you can make a test directory with an under a init, and actually I can show you how you would do that right now. So if I go into contacts, I have test.py. If I wanted to start splitting it up, I would make a test directory, and I would then make an empty file init, and then I'm going to move my test.py to tests. I'm going to get myself in trouble right here. So the exact way you do this depends upon which test runner you use. And I'm honestly not sure how the default Django test runner works, but mostly I'm not sure because we use nose every day, and so it's a little slightly different about discovery. But basically, you're going to name these modules inside of tests, test underscore contact, test underscore views. You're going to. Most of the test runners are picky about having the word test everywhere. So in the file name, in the class name, in the method name, because for God's sake, man, don't forget that you're testing. And so I'm not sure exactly how Django wants you to name it, but you can make that into a package, and it's going to find them just like it normally would. Yeah, so that's what I'm not sure about right now is what the rules are. I think if we went into tests here, and so right now I have everything is under a init. I'm pretty sure that I could copy under a init to let's go try this. Test contacts.py, and I'm going to move it to test views.py. And then I'm going to touch it, so I have a empty. So now I've got an empty under, and I've got these two others. They're the same. I'm going to go in here to test contact, and I'm going to delete that integration test I just wrote. And then I'm going to go into test views. And so now I've split them into two files, and I hope, it looks like you have to do this in Django. So you have to actually import them into the under init. You can, yeah, so there you go. So in the default test runner, they all have to be in that root imported. But if you use something like nose, so there's another test runner called nose, there's one called PyTest. Both of them can be plugged into Django, and they both have slightly saner discovery rules. So you don't have to do that import, which I find reprehensible. So. Any other questions about those tests before we move on? So I want to move on to the edit view because it's similar to create, but we're going to look at how you would reuse a template for both create and edit. So as you might guess, we're going to go back here into our contacts views file. And edit view. So that's no great surprise there. And, oh, I'm sorry, it's not. It is a surprise because I was wrong. It's update view. Sorry. And the reason it's update, and actually there's the acronym CRUD, create something, what is it? Read, thank you, create, read, update, delete, and so they follow that in these namings, thank you. I was just gonna mumble. And I'm actually just gonna copy this, copy my create view as a starting point and call it update contact view. Because I kind of want to have the same behavior, right? And you know, that template that I'm using, that seems like a reasonable starting point. It has the fields I want on it. It does sort of what I want. So you know, let's just. What happens if we just do this? Is this actually enough? So we're going to do. We're going to add the view, or we're going to add the URL for this. So we're going to go to address book URLs. Somebody during the break asked the very astute question that if these apps are so reusable, I'm paraphrasing, if these apps are so reusable, why don't they have their own dang URLs? And so I want to point out that URLs can have inclusion, so you can have sort of a set of contact-related URLs that you include into your project. There's different ways to organize these things. We're just doing it sort of the most straightforward way right now. I'm going to, again, sort of copy this here. So here, though, this is going to be a little bit different, because I'm actually going to do this, pk \d plus. See if I can get my regular expression correct here. I called this the update contact view. So this is the first time that we've seen a URL that has something interesting in it. And that's this regular expression with the question mark PK. So this is just, yes. Okay. Oh, I see. Oh, you were stating the regular expression. Thanks. No, that's a good point. I just want to point out that these are raw strings, so you don't have to do the backslashing, and that's one less thing to think about, so I highly encourage you to use those there. But this is going to basically say, instead of just matching /new, we're going to match /edit followed by some number. Yes? So the question is there a convention in the edit ending in a slash and the new not ending in a slash? And that convention is my laziness. So no, there's not. You should be consistent about that. But the interesting thing is that Django tries to kind of gloss over this for you. And so depending on who you ask, this is either delightful or awful. But if you ask for a view and that ends in a slash and it can't find it, it's going to then look and say, oh, does this view exist without a slash? And it kind of handle the redirection for you. And it'll redirect for you, and vice versa. So, but I encourage you to be consistent, and in that, I will be consistent here. PK is a Django convention and stands for primary key. So basically, what we're saying here is we want to edit the object whose primary key is the last portion of the URL. And the way we construct these links is also a little bit different. So I'm going to open back up my contacts, templates list, contact list. And I want to add an edit link here to the end of each one of these. So URL contacts edit pk equals contact.id. Oops. So a brief digression. If you remember what our contact model looks like, it has a first name and a last name and an email. At no point did we say there's an ID. But because we didn't tell Django that it had a primary key, it gave us an ID for free-ish. Like, it just adds it for you. So that's where this .id comes from. Oh, right, but I actually have to put this inside of a link. So, so like that. So I've got a link, this is edit, and has the URL. So if I run my server now, I sure hope, oops. Oh, right, this is the same thing I saw earlier, wasn't it? So contact, oops. I wonder if this is just this. Maybe. Did I quote the wrong one? Wait, what? Oh, thank you. Okay, that's a bummer. Wait, oh, no, you're wrong. Yeah, you're wrong. I mean, thank you for the suggestion, and it's actually that it's a capital P for a named. I'm missing, so it's question mark capital. Okay, you're kind of right. It was related to that. Oh, sorry. So here I was missing this capital P, which tells the regular expression that this is a named group that I'm giving the name PK. Okay? Cool. So now I actually have links here at the end, and you can't see this, but they are actually /edit/2/edit/1/edit/3, and I actually get an edit-like interface here when I go here. So this seems pretty great. This says add contact, but we'll deal with that in a second. So what happens when I actually try and edit this? So I'm going to change this and give Jason an email address. And I'm going to click save. And that's sort of sad because it just created a new one for me as opposed to actually editing the one I was looking at. So if we look at this, if we go to the edit here and we look at the source, the reason is obvious-ish, because our action in that template, we're looking up the contact's new view as the target for our form. So even though we're showing it with the initial data of Jason's contact record or the one we're trying to edit, we're posting it to new, so we're getting a new one. So this template needs to get smarter, or the views need to get smarter, so that they send people to the right place. So the way we're going to handle this is by in our view classes, we're going to tell the template explicitly where it should be posting to. And so if I open up my, sorry, I got lost here. Contacts views. So one of these methods that we can override is called getContextData. And if you remember, we said that the context is everything that's available to the template when you render it in Django. So the getContextData lets us add or remove, I suppose, things from what the class-based view has by default. So we're going to start by just saying that the context is equal to the superclass. So we'll get the base context. And then here we're just going to say context of target is reverse contacts new. So here we're explicitly saying this is what I'm going to make my target URL. And since this is using the same template, oops, yank, not delete. I'm going to put the same thing down here. But instead of going to contacts new, I'm going to go to contacts edit. And here's where I specify what the actual fill-in is for that URL. So quargs is equal to pk self.get object, excuse me. So in this case, we have this, so we're seeing two different new methods here with our class-based view. The first one is the getContextData, which lets us add things to the information available to the template. And the second one here is on the updateContact view, we're using self.getObject, which when you're working on with a view that works on a single object, will return the object that you're working on. Okay. And in both cases, we're returning the context because that's what's going to get to the template. So now we can go into our edit contact template. And here, instead of saying URL, we can just say action. Did I say target? And by action, of course, I mean target. So that's enough to actually make this work. I also would like the headline to look different. So I'm going to change this to add a conditional here. So if object.id else. So what I've effectively done here, so if you remember we had object list when we were doing our list view. This is not a list, this is a single thing, so it has an object all on its own. And I'm basically just testing, is object.id truthy? And what that means is if it's a brand new one, I won't, if I'm creating one to start with, ID is going to be none because it hasn't actually been saved yet. So that's going to be false, and I'll show add contact. Otherwise, I'll show edit, and then I'll use the under stir method since I'm using the double curlies there. So now when I actually run my server, I will actually see edit. And if I look at the source here, I will see that the action, maybe you can see that? The action is /edit/4, which is actually where I'm at right now. And JSON horrible. There we go. So that's how you can start making more, as you build more complex views, you can start making more information available to them. And this would be a great point. I've now changed the default behavior. This would be a great point to write a test to make sure that I'm actually doing this the right way. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do that right now, but obviously you should. So do as I say, not as I do, please. So it's, I just want to look ahead here. So I'm actually gonna skip ahead in the content because I'm aware of the time. Do we end at 4:20 or 4:40? Oh, then never mind. I'm not gonna skip ahead. Screw that. Okay. So there's two more things to sort of complete our tour of the generic views that we need to implement, and that is the read and the delete. So we've done create and we've done update. We've done this list one that's not really part of CRUD, but we want to, we want to look at these other two sort of in interest of completeness. The delete view is sort of interesting because it actually is operating on a single object just like the update and create is. And the default Django view tries to be safe. It tries to be safe for your users because it requires them to actually say, yes, I really want to delete this, because once you say yes, it's really, really gone. And so as a result, it has a lot of the same idioms that we've seen so far with the create and update views. So I'm going to go ahead and let's just write that view quickly. There was the question earlier about if you have a whole lot of tests, do you leave them all in tests.py or do you split them up? And this is a similar thing where if you start writing apps that have a lot of views, a lot of times it's convenient to start splitting those into a Python package. So I just want to kind of point that out. There's nothing special about the fact that this is views.py as opposed to a views package with submodules in it. It's one of the nice things about Django one of the nice things about Django views at least is that they're just Python code, and they're pretty, if you understand Python, you can start sort of pulling at the threads and understand what's going on under the hood. So I'm going to go ahead and add my delete view superclass. And my, this should all look familiar. This is, we're going to delete a contact. And we do have to give it a template name, and this is for that, this is for the confirmation page that I had mentioned. And then we have to give it a success URL. And I'm going to send this back to the contact list again. So you can see this looks almost identical to our create and update views before we actually started adding stuff to the context there. And the form is going to be pretty similar too. I'm just going to copy and paste it out of here. Delete contact.html. So let's just kind of look at this for a second. I've got this sort of like, are you sure message? And I'm going to fix this to work with 1.5. Oops. So our form is going to post to the delete view. That should be no surprise. There's a CSRF token, no surprise. And then we have the submit button being yes, delete, and we have a no cancel link that just takes you back to the contact list. So if I add this to my URLs, anybody have a thought about how this is going to look? Yes. Oh. In here. Is that you? Oh. So it's not supposed to be object. This is actually this will work, and the reason it works is that when you're doing one of these class-based views, it's always available as object. So if you're doing something generic, object is like the way to go. But if you, it also makes it available as the class name lowercase. So so basically they're interchangeable. You should, my advice is to choose one way of doing it and do that everywhere. I'm not sure if my notes are inconsistent or if I started just doing it one way as I was typing things live versus copy and pasting. But they're the same thing, and it derives that from the model name. Thanks for asking about that. But does anybody have an idea about what our URL is going to look like for delete based on what we've done to date? What's that? Yeah, so we're going to make it delete. Do we need any information in that URL, like such as maybe the primary key? So yeah, I'm gonna start by just copying the edit URL, and so that should, I don't think that's surprising to anyone. And then finally, I just want to make it easy to get to this. So I'm going to go to contacts, templates, contact list. And this, I'm going to, duplicate this link here. Just to give it a delete link. So I expect that when I run my server, I'm going to see I see my delete links. Yeah, I don't know if you might be able to see it in the lower left. You know, this is edit to, this is delete to. I can click on. Are you sure you want to delete Jason Herbst? Yes, delete, and it's gone. So the interesting things about this view, I think there's two interesting things. The first is that it looks an awful lot like an edit operation, and so the Django, if you start looking at the class hierarchy of how these generic views are put together, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff that's shared in common. So there's a lot of stuff for like a single object or for editing with a form that's shared in common. And that really carries over into how they end up working, and it gives you nice consistency across different operations because they have that shared hierarchy. But the other thing that's interesting is that you could use this as a starting point and then actually modify your view so that instead of blowing it away, maybe you just set a delete flag to true. So these are the sort of things that you can start using these views as a building block for. So the final view is just a detail view. So actually showing the details for each of these things. And you know, we could have done this. First, and no particular reason we did not. But the thing we're going to do so the view itself is sort of, you could probably write it just as quickly as I could right now. But the thing I wanted to start with in this case is actually the URLs. So, and the reason I want to do this is I want to show you something that's also very common in Django. So I'm just going to call this /contact/ID. And this is just going to be the contact view. I'm going to call this contacts view. So this is just my detail. But the thing I'm going to do now, instead of going to write the view first, I'm going to actually go into the model, and I'm going to make a change to my model. And I'm going to add another method to it called getAbsoluteURL. I should have mirrored my, sorry, I should have mirrored my screens. Something weird. getAbsoluteURL is a Django convention on your models that basically says, if you're trying to display information about this particular object, about this instance, what URL can I find that at? So at Eventbrite, we traffic in events and tickets, and so we have an event model, and when you do getAbsoluteURL on it, it gives you the URL to that event page to buy a ticket for that event. And this gets used by default all over the place. So for like our edit view, we've given it a success URL of the contact list, but had we not overridden that, it's going to try and go to object.getAbsoluteURL by default. So this is actually a really handy method to implement if you're going to be using these class-based views for a bunch of stuff, because it eliminates one thing that you have to do to kind of get up and going. And it's pretty simple. We're just going to return reverse, just like we have before in other places. Self.id. And I need to import reverse, don't I?
Can you explain once more what reverse does?
Sure. So resolvers, import reverse. So reverse, so if you think about urls.py as being a way to take the path of a URL and resolve it to some Django code or some Python code, reverse does the reverse. So it takes the name of some Django code or this label you've given it in the URLs file and figures out what URL path you would need to go to get there. So this means if I'm sort of early in the development and I don't actually know how I want my URLs laid out yet, if I'm using reverse and I decide I want to change sort of the hierarchy of things, I don't actually have to go and change any code. I just change it in urls.py. There's this principle, don't repeat yourself, dry. So it's sort of adhering to that, or helping you adhere to that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Great. And then I'm going to go and I'm actually going to go write the view, which, like I said, is pretty uninteresting right now. But we'll do it for completeness. And I'm going to put this one here. At the very top, since it's sort of the basic one. Template name is equal to contact.html. And then, so we'll see, we'll make a template. And so that I can say contact here, I can say object, it's sort of up to you. And the only piece of information I'm not showing right now is the email, so I'll just put that right here, contact.email. And finally, so I'll use that get absolute URL method I just created to link the name to the actually detail page. And this is another example of how in Django templates, even though we just made this method, we know it's a method. There's no parentheses. So it's weird. So, right, so now I've got my detail view, and I can, I could potentially add other things to that. I could add a way to send an email. I could add a map, that kind of thing. So sort of for the last thing I want to, so there's 2 more sections of the tutorial. I want to get through part of the next one. I think the final one will probably be left as an exercise to the reader, just based on our time. But what I want to talk about is sort of this third class of Django things that we haven't really been doing anything explicitly with, which is forms. So we've rendered forms into our templates, but we haven't actually had to declare one because Django's been doing it all for us. It's been taking our model, it's been inspecting these fields for us, and then it's been generating a form for us. And if you think about forms as something that takes user input and turns it into Python objects safely, that's how I think about it. It's something that's going to apply validation rules, it's going to apply consistency checks, and it's going to give you back a Python object that you can actually work with. And so this is really, validating user input is a really important thing when you're writing web applications because you're dealing with awful, awful people, and they're called your users. And so you need to be able to validate and be able to trust that what you're getting back is sort of in scope. It's what you expect. So there's these Django forms that do just this for us, and they also have the nice side effect of having enough information to render it as HTML. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of build on what Django's been doing for us and add functionality that's to the view that's not found in the model. And in particular, we're gonna make it so that you have to confirm the email address and that the two actually have to match before you can save or create your contact. As an example of, this is something where we want this extra field to show up. We want to make sure the two match, but we're only going to save one copy of it. So, sort of how do we go about doing that? By convention, if you look at our contacts application here, we have models, we have views. By convention, forms are stored in a forms.py package or forms.py module or forms package. So we're gonna start creating one of these here. And we're gonna import forms from Django. And so there's a few different kinds of sort of flavors of forms in Django. The one that we've been using is called a model form. And it's the one that takes a model and introspects it, looks at the field definitions, and adds fields for you sort of automatically. So we can actually start with that same basis and then add our additional functionality that we want on top of it. So this might look kind of familiar. We're gonna have a contact form, and we're gonna inherit from forms.model form. And Django uses this inner meta class to configure things like forms and models. So on a model, you can use this class to actually override what the database table name should be. It gave us one of its own, but we could specify it if we wanted to. Here, we're going to use it for telling it what model we're making a form for. So at this point, this form is basically exactly like the one Django has been making for us. If we, save this. And I'm just going to flip over my other tab here and open up the views file. Here in the contact, create and edit contact, I can say form class is equal to forms.contact form. So this is another way to override it and say, no, I want to use my real class. And I need to import forms up here. So if we went and ran on the server right now, we would see no changes. So that's not very interesting. We actually want to add this extra field to confirm the email. So just like models, forms use a declarative syntax to define what the fields are going to be. So on a model form, if you start declaring fields, they're just added in addition to the ones already there. So I'm going to form email field. The first element or first parameter is the label, and I'm going to say required is true. So let's switch over here. Oops. And run the server. Oh, right, I did not activate things. There we go. So if I go to edit now, so you'll see now I have my confirm email field showing up here. And if I try to save, it's going to tell me it's required. And if I try to put some garbage in there, it's going to tell me it has to be a valid email address. But at this point, I can put Nathan@Yergler.net in here. And it doesn't, it's not actually doing any it's not doing any validation between the fields. So when you actually process a form, there's two different sort of processes it goes through. First, it validates all of your fields. So it turns them into Python objects. It makes sure that they meet, sort of the type checks. It makes sure they meet the range checks. So if you have like an integer field, that have min and max, it's going to make sure that the data falls within that. And then it has the form processing, where you can actually compare fields or look at things across fields. This is an important distinction because when it comes to the validating the fields, Django doesn't guarantee what order that's going to happen in. So when we go to edit our or we want to compare our confirm email and our regular email address, we may not have actually processed one or the other when we're doing the other one. So we need a way to do this sort of at the end of things. And the way we're going to do that is by adding what's called the clean method. So the clean method gets called after all the fields have been turned into Python objects. And this is where you can do things where you can kind of compare fields. You can assert that they don't exist in your database already. You can do all sorts of checks here that you couldn't do in the other places. And the interesting thing, I find lots of things interesting, is that even though these fields all are required equals true on them, and we get errors that get raised if you don't provide them. So even if there's errors, clean still gets called. So you can't make an assumption that just because you're entering the clean method that everything else went fine and went swimmingly. And it's because of that when we write this, we're not going to say, so when we get in here, all the data that's been cleaned so far is available as in a dictionary, self.cleaned data. So instead of doing this square bracket, so it's a dictionary, right? Instead of doing square bracket access, I'm going to do .get. Because I don't actually, even though it's required, it may not have been maybe there was an error. Maybe the user didn't actually fill in the confirm email, and so it's not going to be in that dictionary. I can't assume that it's there at this point. So clean is always called, even if there are errors earlier in processing. So in this case, though, what I want to do is I just want to check, is self.cleaned.data.get email. So this is my field from my model. Is that equal to, actually what I want to do is I want to say, is it not equal to the confirm email? And if it's not, I'm going to raise a validation error. I misspelled what? Thank you. Oh, thank you. And that validation error gets imported from Django core exceptions. So a validation error is sort of a special exception class you can raise that Django is going to catch during form processing. And it's going to take whatever you pass it as the argument there in the quotes. It's going to show that as your error message. So when we saw that before, like this field is required, that was some other code deep in Django raising a validation error and saying this field is required. And then clean has to return the cleaned data. And this sort of just hints that you could actually mutate this at this point. You could make changes to it if you wanted to override things or something. So I still have the server running on the other tab. You notice it restarted automatically for me. By default, it's going to watch your Python files and restart as you're developing, so that kind of helps speed you along. So now if I go and edit this, and I try to put in Nathan, so now I get this other error message that I just created. And if I put in Ashish at example.com, I'm actually able to save. So we're like 2/3 of the way there. The final bit here is that when I go to the edit page, when I go to the edit page, it sure would be nice if I were coming here just to edit my name, if I didn't have to type the email address in again, as a starting point. And so what we want to do is we want to set the initial value of that field. So Django forms have an initial state that comes in, and when you're doing a model form, that initial state comes directly from the model instance. So it's looking at the database, it's going to populate those fields for you, but confirm email doesn't have a corresponding field in the model table, right? So there's never going to be anything in that one as the default. So we need to give it something. So what we're going to do is we're going to override the constructor for the form. We're going to take args and quargs. So forms, there's a few different things that forms take. Model forms in particular have an instance keyword argument. And that refers to the actual model instance that we're editing at this point. So I'm going to say if quargs.get instance, so if I've been passed an instance, I'm going to get that email address out. So keep in mind, quargs instance, the instance keyword argument, is a instance of our contact model at this point. So I'm going to get the email address there, and then I'm going to do something that's looks a little bit magical. So I'm going to call quargs set default initial. So but this is basically saying if Quargs already has an initial dictionary, give me that. Otherwise, set it to an empty dictionary, and then set the confirm email key to that email address. So this is just Python dictionary manipulation. And then I'm going to return super. So continue. So now I can just actually fall back to the default Django behavior. So now if I refresh this page, my indentation is screwy. On line, what's that? Oh, is that what it? Oh, thanks. There we go. So now you can see that when I go to edit, this is set up correctly. And if I go back to my add view, so if I go to /new, of course we expect it to be empty, but and the reason the code doesn't blow up trying to look at instance is because we have that guard around it. If instance was provided, so an instance will not be provided if you're adding one because you're not editing anything yet. So that sort of talks a little bit about form validation, and we've got about 10 minutes, and so I want to just show you a little bit of what you can do, of other ways you can work with the form manually, and then there's a section in the handout and on the website about using relationships in the database and more advanced form stuff, and so so you can look at that at your own time, and my email address is on there if you have questions that come up about it. I'm happy to take those via email, sort of after the fact. So up until now, when we've been, let's look at our edit form. So up until now, we've just been doing this form.as unordered list method in order to render out all of our form fields. Forms are pretty interesting in this respect. So they actually act as a dictionary where you can access the individual fields by their name. And remember what we said earlier about the way Django templates work with dictionary access. So they actually turn it into dots, which looks a little bit weird. But so you can do things like form.email and form.firstname, form.lastname, and form.confirm email. So we'll leave both of them in there, and let's just like look at this and compare what's going on. Excuse me. So if I refresh this, you see I now have these fields at the top. So just accessing them by name just gives us the actual widget that gets used. But you can see here that it's rendering it with the exact same IDs and names as it uses down here. So that you don't want to actually do this, but this sort of is like the first baby step toward doing something more interesting with rendering that you might care about. So there's a whole set of extra fields you can access, and what I'm going to do here is so you can also do this for field in form. So suppose I want to customize this to use divs, which is not sort of a built-in thing, and I want to show that you can have help text associated with your fields, and I want to show the errors in a particular place. What I can do is I can actually do this. I can do div id equals, oops. So here I'm making a div and I'm giving it an ID, and that field.AutoID is going to be sort of the starting portion of the ID for this particular field. So ID underscore email, ID underscore first name, etc. And so I can append underscore container here so that if I write CSS, it's easy to get at. There's this field.help text, which will provide help if it's available. And then I can do label tag, which is exactly what it sounds like. And then we already saw that if you just emit the field, you get the input. And then I can also do something like this, where I say field auto ID errors. And in here, so this gives you this little idea that there's really fine-grained control over how things render. And if you're working with designers or working with people who are more well-versed in the front-end sort of development practices, they can use these tags to be really fine, to be really specific about how they want things to be laid out and to be rendered using your Django form. And you can also, the slides actually have some examples of even more detailed ways you can like decorate it with special CSS classes depending on what kind of error you have. So we have about 5 minutes left. There is a survey, and somebody has the URL for that survey. And Jason, could you grab me one of those pieces of paper off of the, yeah. I am going to, yes. I'm going to put that URL up. So I really appreciate everybody coming this afternoon and spending the afternoon listening to me. Google/PVHDC, and they've asked me to ask you to fill out, to look at this survey and take a look at it and provide some feedback about my tutorial, about the PyCon tutorials generally, so that we can do a better job next time we do them. So thank you very much. There's additional content in your handout, and I will stick around after to answer any other questions that you might have. Thank you. So are people able to have a requirements file put together and they're doing pip install and it's downloading? Great. So while that's running, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context about Django and about this scaffolding that it provides. So the whole idea of a framework is that it's a bunch of code to help you get up and going faster and help you sort of handle common situations in a reasonable default manner. Things like parsing an HTTP request or printing out the request into a response. Things like selecting data out of the database. These are things that we don't want to have to do by ourselves. And so the framework gives us this sort of scaffolding, this framework for these tools for us to use. And it does this in a couple of ways. One of them is with HTTP, with making sure you can parse the request and the HTTP request and emit the response back to the server. And the other way is with file system scaffolding. So putting things in particular places in the file system so that engineers know where to look for things. So you can see, so I finished installing Django here. You can see that it did a few things here. It also, if I look in the bin directory or the scripts directory on Windows, it gave me this new Django admin tool. And this is sort of a tool for starting your project. So in Django, there's sort of two high-level organizational units in Django. There's the idea of a project, which is the thing that you're going to deploy, the thing that has the settings, the URLs specific for your site. And then there's the application, which is something that's potentially reusable that you might be able to plug into different projects. So, for example, tagging is something that lots of different projects need the ability to tag objects, like photos on Flickr or bookmarks on Delicious when it was still Delicious, that sort of thing. But you don't want to have to do that every time. So there might be a tagging application you can plug in. So we're gonna start making a project by running Django admin, the cunningly named start project command. And our project is, we're gonna make an address book project. So I'm saying start project, address book, and then I say dot as the very last parameter here. And that just tells it not to make me an extra level of directories. And once you run that, you see you have an address book directory. And it has a few things in it that we're going to look at sort of as we go through building things. Let me move that up the screen a little bit. So inside of my project, there's three things that we care about inside there. There's the settings file, which has sort of the configuration for this project you're building and for what's going to be your site. There's the URLs.py, which tells it how to map URLs to actual Python code. And then there's this WSGI, this whiz. There are some issues this morning with PyPy in one of the other tutorials, and I don't have any reason to think that those have necessarily been resolved. So well, let's try this way first. So if I put Django 1 equals 1.5 here, what I was going to say is you can also specify a link to a tarball directly here. So if you have your own things that you depend on that you want to list, you can do that just fine. So I'm going to say Django equals 1.5. The notes do say 1.4.3. That's what it was out when I wrote those the first time. We're going to do 1.5 today. And then I can do pip install -r requirements.txt, which is actually going to go and read that requirements file and download Django for me, and hopefully install it. So So that's going a little slowly. So I'm just going to switch to another terminal here and show you the other way to do this. So instead of Django 1.5, I can actually put the full path to the tarball on Django's servers, on the Django project servers, which is admittedly harder or longer to type. So if you don't see tutorial at the beginning of your lines or something in parentheses, that means you didn't activate the virtual environment, and Philip can help you with that. Is that? Well, yeah, it's maximized right now. So let me. How's that? So if you set up your file to look like this instead of just Django equals equals, this will probably download a little bit faster for you. Totally okay. If you did 1.4.3, you're totally okay. 1.5 has some really nice additions, but they're, I don't think we're actually going to wind up touching on them very deeply today. So, and the nice thing is that, so we're going to be talking about class-based views for a big part of the tutorial, and they work the same in both versions, but the 1.5 docs are much, much better, so you can sort of mix and match that way too. How we do some of this in the terminal, maybe. There we go. Is that large enough, or should I make it bigger still? Bigger still. Is that visible? Right, so I mentioned that this afternoon we're going to need to use something called virtualenv, and we're going to use pip with a requirements file. And so there was a Git repository that you could clone. I'm actually going to start from scratch here, and then the Git repo is useful if people need to catch up along the way. So creating a virtual environment is pretty easy. I'm going to make a new directory here called tutorial. I am going to get rid of my old tutorial. And I'm going to make a directory called tutorial. And see, wasn't that easy? And then I'm simply going to run virtualenv tutorial. And if I look inside the tutorial directory now, I'm going to see a few different things. I'm going to see a bin directory, this lib, include, and this is basically mocking out things that are usually stored in the root part of the file system. If you're on Windows, you'll see something called scripts here instead of bin, but it should look pretty similar to this. And inside of this bin directory, there's a bunch of scripts. So you notice there's actually a Python executable inside this bin directory. And this is a special Python because it sets up everything to point to our virtualenv and not the system Python site packages, so it keeps it isolated when you run this one. So to enter the virtual environment, you do source bin activate. If you're on Windows, this looks like, I think there's a bin activate.bat file inside there. And you'll see that my prompt has changed. So it says tutorial at the beginning of each line, and that lets me know that I'm inside of this virtual environment and that things that I do here aren't going to impact the rest of the system. They're just going to be for this environment. So before we can actually make a Django project, we need to install Django, of course. And this is sort of our first opportunity to do something where we're very specific about and very deterministic about what versions we want. So I'm going to make a new file here in my tutorial called requirements.txt. And this is where I'm going to list everything that as my project grows, this is where I would list everything it depends upon. And I could write just Django here. And that would actually be enough for me to get Django installed. But that's going to get the latest version of Django at any given time. And I'm actually care that I get a particular version. For those of you following along with the notes, we're on page 4, section 1.2.1. I see people frantically flipping, so that's, sorry. So I could just do Django 1.5 equals 1.5, and this would make sure that I get Django 1.5. The other thing I can do here, though, let's see if I can actually do this. So there are sort of 3 factors that are important, and I'm going to talk about those each here individually. So first of all, isolation, determinism, and similarity. These are the three things I look for when I'm setting up my development environment for some kind of project. And isolation basically means I want this project to be isolated from the rest of my system. I don't want things that I've installed for something else, creeping into the environment, and I don't want. I also don't want things that I'm installing for this project to interfere with other things I might be doing. The reason for this is determinism. We want to make sure that we can replicate this environment when we go to deploy, when we go to production, when we go to actually ship our application. And so by making sure it's isolated, we kind of have a record of what's going on. And I also look for similarity, which is simply something that's as similar to my production environment as I can get. So virtual env is a pretty popular and well-known way to do this isolation. There's other ways to do it, but this is a really good one. This is what we're going to use today. And determinism is all about dependency management, right? It's all about knowing what goes into your application and what you're actually using. So what we're going to use today is a requirements file with pip, but there's other approaches to this that I've linked to in the slides. One of them is simply making a setup.py for your application and being really explicit about the versions there and the dependencies. The other one is a tool called build-out, which sort of combines some of the things that virtual env and pip do together. But the really important thing here is that you identify not just your dependencies, but what versions you use, because that can make all the difference. And an example of this is if you just say that you want simple JSON because you want JSON support for your application, well, that's great. But then last month, a new version of simple JSON was released that broke backwards compatibility. So if you had just said simple JSON, next time you go to deploy this application, you're getting the newest version, which unbeknownst to you, actually breaks your app. So by specifying versions, you're testing exactly what you're going to deploy with, and you're deploying exactly what you tested, and you have some confidence, some additional confidence about how this is going to operate, how they're going to interact. And finally, this idea of similarity. Having an environment that's similar to your production environment sort of eliminates one big question mark when you're trying to debug a large system. So there's a tool called Vagrant that we're not going to talk about this afternoon, but I encourage you to go look at. It's basically a way that you can manage virtual machines in your local laptop for development purposes, and we use it at Eventbrite. I'm happy to kind of show people afterward during the break how we use it. But it basically lets everybody, we deploy on Ubuntu, but most of our engineers have Macs. And so we can use Vagrant to give them an Ubuntu virtual machine on their Mac and manage that so that it's very, very similar to the servers we're actually deploying to. So I think at this point, we're going to switch over and actually look at how we do some of this. Good afternoon. Thank you for enduring and showing up. And the portion you just observed is free. It's a free bonus content that I like to do with my talks. My name is Nathan Yergler. I'm a principal engineer at Eventbrite, and we're a Python shop that has been using Django pretty extensively for the past few years. And so I'm here today to tell you about using Django effectively, give you an introduction to Django, and specifically to some of the newer features in Django, like class-based views, some of the forms, and also focus on writing tests for your code as you build Django applications. So this is definitely an entry-level afternoon, and I hope that by the time you leave, you have a good sense of how to get started with Django, how to write tests for different things, and how to sort of approach putting your application together. There are I have four of my esteemed colleagues and friends with me this afternoon who are standing along the back, and they are waving their hands at you right now because they are all so happy to see you and so happy to be here. except Jason, who is not waving because he's not happy apparently. They're here to help you along as we work through the application. And so they're going to be wandering around, trying to help you out. If you have questions as we go along, you can flag one of them down. You can also ask me a question, and I will endeavor to answer your question. So we're gonna, sort of the format is we're gonna talk a little bit about different things, then we're gonna demonstrate it. And the goal here is to, by the end of the afternoon, we're gonna build a little address book application just as a demonstration of starting a Django project and of using some of these features that we wanna focus on. There's a break halfway through. I will endeavor not to forget it. So I said this. So what do I mean by effective Django? There's 3 things that I really hope you take away from this afternoon, and that is that there are ways to use Django that get up and going really quickly, and that get you started really quickly, but they wind up causing problems down the road. And if you focus on these principles of cohesion, testability, and scalability, you're going to wind up with an application that's going to be easier to maintain in the long term, easier to add engineers to, easier to make changes to, because you're able to run the tests. I'm just going to pause while maybe the slides come back. So effectivedjango.com/tutorial is the URL for the content here that we're going to be going through, and /slides/tutorial is where the slides are. You may find some or both of those to be useful. So so I guess I want to talk a little bit before we get started about your development environment and what to think about as you're working on a project.